tonight from the government. Dr. Andrew Morrison is Minister for Defence, People, Veterans and Service Families. He served in the Royal Navy as a medic for 18 years, including a 6-month tour of Iraq in 2003. Emily Thornberry was elected to Parliament 18 years ago. She was Shadow Foreign Secretary for 4 years before running unsuccessfully for party leader in 2020. She now shadows what is effectively the government's in-house lawyer, the Attorney General. Helen Morgan is in just her 2nd year as an MP. She won the North Shropshire by-election, overturning centuries of Conservative domination there, taking the Lib Dem tally to 14. She now speaks for her party on levelling up, housing and communities. Fraser Nelson is editor of the right-leaning weekly magazine The Spectator, which has been running for nearly 200 years. He also writes a column for the Daily Telegraph. And Danny Sriskandaraja is the chief executive of Oxfam GB, the charity formed during the Second World War that pledges to end poverty and injustice. In his most recent blog, he said Britain's global reputation as a compassionate, generous nation is draining away. Welcome to our panel, welcome to our audience here in Bristol, and of course welcome to you at home as well. As ever, we're on social media, and just to remind you that we are also on iPlayer at 8 o'clock every week, as well as, of course, being after the 10 o'clock news on BBC One. So, let's get our question now. The panel here, it's a bit of an article of faith on Question Time. They do not know what the questions are in advance, but let's hear our first one now from our audience, from Chris Blake.
Are the government's plans to house migrants in ex-military bases and potentially vessels a credible alternative to using hotels?
Right, so we've been hearing quite a lot about this this week. Emily, let's kick off with you.
I mean, I don't know what they're doing. I have to say that, you know, it is something which the public takes very seriously. They want to have answers to this, and rightly so, you know, for a whole variety of reasons. But the asylum system is broken, and it was the Conservative Party that broke it. You know, before we left power, there were 14,000 people claiming asylum in the UK waiting for a decision, and now there is 160,000, and it's going up all the time. And what I think they're doing is they're not actually making a serious attempt to try to deal with the issue. I think what they're doing is they're just trying to divide us. They're just trying to distract us. They're just trying to get the headlines, just so that people can start fighting amongst one another. We can start arguing amongst ourselves and forget that actually what needs to happen is they need to start making some decisions about people who have come here to claim asylum, make those decisions quickly, be firm, be fair, make a decision fast, and get on and move on. It's not fair on the people who come here and claim asylum to be here for... I mean, I think that there are statistics like it's 450 days that you have to wait for a decision to be made if you're an adult. It's 550 days you have to wait if you're a child.
But in terms of the
time,
question, Emily...
You live in a hotel and you cannot do anything. You can't work. You can't do anything. You just sit there. Your life is suspended and you wait for a decision to be made. And it is simply wrong, and it's costing the country, it's £8 million a day?
It's £6 million a day,
£6 million.
But just in terms of... So I hear what you're saying, Toz. You just think it should be faster, clearly. But in terms of Chris's question, are the government's plans to house migrants in ex-military bases, potentially vessels? That's a credible alternative to using hotels. I haven't had Labour objecting to that.
OK, so first of all...
Are you objecting to that?
Yeah, first of all, there's not... I mean... It's not as though they're saying that it's going to be an alternative. It's going to be an add-on. It's not like, and when we've asked questions about this, they're not going to be moving people out of their hotels and putting them in the army bases or in some sort of ship somewhere. It's an add-on to all the hotels they're already using. The answer to getting people out of hotels is to make the decisions faster, is to work with the National Crime Agency and actually have some people focusing on the gangs to make sure that we go for the gangs.
OK, but just in terms of the question...
Right.
Do Labour support or object to the idea of using barracks to house asylum seekers?
I mean, I think that, as I say, I think that it's not actually... What I object to with the use of barracks is that it's going to be used as an add-on to the hotel. Okay, so it's not a solution to the hotels.
But in principle, you don't have a problem with asylum seekers being put in barracks, just...
I don't have a problem with people being treated humanely, and I don't have a problem with a system which is firm and fast and fair. But, frankly, none of that is here with that. All they're trying to do is set up a fight. and an argument so that we don't think about the core problem and the core reason why we have a problem.
OK, so you're not committing to as to whether you're supporting barracks or not. No. Andrew, is it a credible alternative? What
we've got to do is establish safe and legal routes for people who are seeking asylum. 45,000 people crossed the Channel last year. Some people come to grief as a result of that. That's an appalling situation. Yeah. And we should be doing everything and stretching every sinew to reduce that and get at the awful criminals that prey on these vulnerable people.
But the government's not talking about increasing safe and legal routes until after it has reduced the current number, the current backlog. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong. So in the meantime, it's suggesting using military barracks. Is that a credible alternative?
Well, we've got to get people out of hotels. There's no question about that. It's bad for the individuals. It's bad for the communities in which they tend to be. It's all-round bad news. I think this is part of the solution, but I have to say, dealing with this, Fiona, is going to be multifaceted. There is no magic wand that's going to deal with this situation. We will deal with it, I'm confident of that, but the solution is going to be multifaceted and actually really rather complicated.
And in terms of being credible, you've got 166,000 odd people waiting to have their asylum claim processed, and the barracks will house something like 5,000.
As I say, it's going to be part of the solution. It's not the whole part, but I think it's a credible bit in the jigsaw.
All right, there's lots of hands. Let's come to you. Yes, the man of the cloth there. Let's hear from you.
Is it really true to say that it is a credible situation? Our obligations towards the Geneva Convention on Refugees are actually being upheld by the way that we are treating refugees at the moment, or I should say asylum seekers. I have the joy of having asylum seekers in the parish where I work. They do not harm our community. They positively enhance our community. They are a great bunch of guys who are able to have made a real change for the better for the church where I am and for the community where I am. It makes me so upset that this is seen as a problem and we're not listening to the stories of these asylum seekers who potentially have got so much to offer and have come from really unsafe places. They need to be given. They need more protection.
Woman here the young woman in the jacket and the sweater, yeah.
Understandably, lots of the focus is on migrants who cross the Channel and end up in these barracks. But why isn't there greater discussion around the undocumented population, given that if we're talking about the welfare of these people who come here, they're an even more vulnerable population, often involved in things like modern slavery. No one seems to be seriously proposing solutions or giving much airtime to them.
OK. The man here in the blue top.
It's got to be better than putting them in hotels, where it was reported yesterday that it costs an individual £150 to put them in a hotel. Which hotels are they staying in? I certainly couldn't afford to stay in those hotels. So BASIS has got to be a financially better prospect.
Danny.
Well, look, this is a tragedy in so many ways. You know, on your last point, the bitter reality is also that some of those hotels are being paid for out of the aid budget. Yesterday, we found out in an independent report that a third of the UK's aid budget is now being spent in this country paying for hotels because the asylum system is not able to process people fairly. And I want to come back to the point made by the gentleman. You know, Fiona, you talked about my blog and talking about a compassionate Britain. Oxfam was founded 80 years ago on the basis that Britain was a compassionate and generous society. We helped build the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We helped write the Refugee Convention, and now we've got governments that are trying to rip up those obligations. And what worries me most of all is the rhetoric, the sort of short-termism in this rhetoric involves over-promising and under-delivering and ends up, you know, stoking a fire of public anger that no politician seems to have any idea of how they're going to put the fire out. And that's really bad and really worrying for politics and trust in government.
I mean, you've described the government's line on immigration as crazy.
If you take the Australian example, because I think a lot of government policy here is modelled on what Australia did. Australia had a horrendous approach to offshoring the processing of people who arrived on boats. It involved small numbers of people at huge cost, billions of dollars, and it involved reneging on international obligations. But what people forget, of course, is that Australia in addition to while doing that, was welcoming refugees through large-scale resettlement programs. 1 million people have been accepted into Australia as refugees or on humanitarian programs over the last 70 years. So where is that large-scale resettlement program to provide meaningful, safe and legal routes so that we can show the world that we are a compassionate nation?
Fraser.
The big change in the last few years is the arrival of people smugglers, who now accounts for something like almost like half of all the arrivals here, asylum seekers, are taken by these guys who are basically the closest we've got to the modern slave trade. Now, the problem is, unless you can tackle the problem, then you're sending people who pay between £3,000 and £15,000 for this journey. You need to break the people smugglers' business model and to do it fairly. At the moment, I think I'm right in saying it costs £20,000 to help an asylum seeker in Britain. Now, for that money, how many could you help overseas? That's a sort of discussion the government needs to have. Now, of course, it makes sense to do everything you can for those who arrive here, just to process them as quickly as you can. But when it comes to the accommodation, I think, to me, what's missing is that right now we ban them from working. We say to them, we're going to force you to basically stay at the taxpayer's expense, to stay on welfare, to wait for 1.5 years to get processed, and we're not going to let you do anything to support yourself while you're here. Now, these are some of the most energetic, most ingenious people that are incredibly creative. It seems to me a waste of money, a waste of talent to ban them from working. Yeah. So I think that is something that would save the accommodation. Just don't force them to stay at the taxpayer's expense. Look at the way when the Ukrainian refugees came in here, it was a very different situation. We allowed them to work. I think most of Ukrainian refugees managed to find a job, and many of them are now self-financing. I think this is a country with something like 1 million vacancies right now, one of the most we've ever had. We badly need workers. We've got people desperate, I think, to do a good living here. So I think it's possible to have a system where you can... and by the way, I do support the government's plan for Rwandan deportations. I didn't used to. But I came around to the fact that this is the only real way of trying to break the human traffickers' business model. It worked with not so long ago. I think Albanians were accounting for almost half of the arrivals of small boats. That was Albania is, a safe country. Now, when the government managed to do a deal with the Albanian government and start deporting people, then the number of Albanians coming here went down very, very quickly. I think the same thing can happen with the small boats, and then we can focus on helping people who are here legitimately and getting through the backlog. But a whole bunch of things need to change. And I think that letting them work while they're here is a major step forward.
And here in the white shirt.
Oh, hello. Conservatives have been in power now for nearly 13 years, and they still haven't got anything. They're not building suitable places for the immigrants that come over that want to stay here, while everything's being processed, and putting them up in barracks, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
I think that's ridiculous. We need investment, and I don't understand why it's taken Conservatives so long, and their ridiculous idea of flying everybody to Rwanda, I think that's stupid. They need something that's more humanitarian. They need something that's more thought out, because there's a lot of people, a lot of potential that's coming over that can help England and the United Kingdom. And at the moment, we're wasting it because we're not letting them work. We're putting them up in hotels. We should have things that's better. And we've got a housing crisis as well. Conservatives should be on this. They shouldn't be 13 years in and still scratching their heads.
OK. Well, Daniel, I'm going to come back to you. Andrew, I'll come back to you, obviously. Before I do, Helen, we've not heard from you. So are the government's plans to house migrants in ex-military bases, potentially vessels, a credible alternative to using hotels? And of course, we've already seen the Foreign Secretary, the former Home Secretary, objecting to a military base in their constituencies, and also another Tory MP, Edward Lee, also doing the same.
Well, I think overall we shouldn't be in a situation where we've run out of hotel space and now we're looking for ever more inventive ways of finding places for these people to languish while we process their claims. I think, clearly they have to go somewhere because we haven't dealt with them properly. But it's outrageous that we've got 160,000 people languishing in hotels on £5 a day, waiting to be homed. And frankly, I was astonished by Andrew's answer because the government haven't prioritised safe and legal routes at all. They've prioritised the deterrent and the demonising of people who are coming here for safety at every step of the way. And I think it's extraordinary that we've heard that this evening because actually it's clearly the right answer. And the other thing that makes me quite angry is that the safe and legal routes that are in place, we know are a fallacy. We know there are people in Afghanistan who have a right to come here, who've been asked to go to the Taliban to get their documents stamped to come here. And I think, frankly, the way we're treating migrants at the moment, it's not only incompetent and highly costly, it's frankly inhumane and it's shameful.
Let me hear from a couple more people. Yes, the man here in the blue sweater towards the front.
Yeah, hi. I think that the government seems to be focusing on the wrong issue here. It's focusing on the symptoms and not the cause. And we constantly keep hearing sound bites from this government about Rwanda. I mean, if I was an asylum seeker looking to cross the Channel, I'd be more concerned about drowning. I mean, these people are willing to risk their life. So I wouldn't give a damn about going to Rwanda. I'd be more concerned about the risk of crossing the Channel in a small dinghy. The actual the cause is obviously we've got kind of global issues where people are being displaced through war or famine, and I get that that's going to take a while to resolve. But basically, these gangs that are exploiting these people, no one seems... I mean, it's not really in France's interest to stop it because they're just moving the problem on to another country. So we're not actually sort of tackling the cause. And we hear, like, words from the Conservative government, but nothing... And this gentleman's right. We had 13 years, and the situation... And we've had Brexit, where we're supposed to take control of our own borders, and the situation is worse, and it's getting worse. Now we're looking at... But trying to scratch around, looking for disused buildings to house these people. When's it going to start getting better?
Let me just ask, because obviously the government is pursuing this policy in the belief that it is popular with the electorate. And so far, what we've heard is pretty universal criticism of it. Is there anyone here who supports what the government is doing? I see loads of hands going down. Yes, you, sir, in the pink shirt. Let's hear from you.
I'd like to say that most people would support offering a safe haven to people escaping terror and war zones. Isn't part of the problem the ability to filter people? I understand that the processing personnel have been reduced by about 40%, which is causing a logjam.
OK. Well, listen, let's put these points. Andrew, so you're hearing... I have to say, I mean, when I asked for support, I didn't really see an awful lot. And you had the gentleman here who was saying, you've been in power for 13 years. Yeah. When's it going to get better?
Yeah. It's a fair call, but it's a pan-European problem. So you go to every country in Europe, you'll get a similar story. You'll get it in France,
yes, but you're not in government for them. You're in government for here. So what are you going to do about here?
It sets the context and it explains the complexity of the situation. Now, look, we've got to stop the boats for the reasons I've explained. Must stop the boats. We've got to get people out of hotels. That's completely unsatisfactory. What I would say, though, is there are safe and legal routes, and we've heard a couple of them described. We've had people from Syria, Hong Kong. We've had people from Ukraine, particularly, including in my constituency. These things exist. What I'm interested to see is what happens with Albania, since we're now repatriating Albanians because they have no basis to be in this country. And if we see, as we anticipate, a fall-off in people making that hazardous journey from Albania, a safe country, to the UK, then I think that will be an indicator of success. But I come back to what I said originally, Fiona. The solution to this isn't one-off, it's multifactorial, and the things we've heard described this evening are all part of a solution, but it's going to be long and complex, and at the end of the day, it will be incomplete. There will always be people who make that hazardous journey. What we have to do is to drive that down to a minimum and make sure genuine asylum seekers seek safe and legal routes to claim asylum in this country where they have always been welcomed.
OK. I'm going to take another question. Before I do, I just want to say that we are on a 2-week break after this programme for Easter, as indeed are MPs. And when we return, we will be in York and then we'll be in Ealing in West London. So if you'd like to come to a future programme, the address is on the screen here. Have a look there and you can see how to apply. So that's York and then Ealing in West London. We would love to see you. Right, let's take another question. I'm going to try and get through a number, if I can, tonight. Jeff Halls.
Can we ever get to net zero?
Right, OK. So the UK policy is to get to net zero by 2050, so to put no more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than we take out. Can we get to net zero, Andrew? The government's made a big play today of its Green Day, whatever it's calling it.
Yeah. The answer is yes, we can and we must. And there are two reasons for that, and they're two sides of the same coin. One is the environment and our need to protect it. Two is our security. And if the past few months have taught us anything at all, is that we must become more self-reliant on energy. 40% of our electricity last year was generated from renewables. We've cut our emissions since 2010 by 50%. That's the fastest rate in the G7. We're doing well in this country, and also that's generating prosperity for us and jobs, including in my own constituency. So there's every good reason, whether you believe in climate change or not, whether you think it's man-made or not, to be supporting this. And the answer to the gentleman is yes, we can, and yes, we will.
Danny.
I agree with Andrew on one point, which is that we must. I was in Somalia recently, where there is a heartbreaking drought, the worst drought we've seen in 40 years. And people in that part of the world who've had nothing to do with climate breakdown are suffering the consequences of climate breakdown today. There's been an 8-fold increase in humanitarian need as a result of extreme weather events that are driving droughts, floods, wildfires, cyclones. And so we have to do something like this. But the plans that the government have set out today are tinkering at the edges. There's no new money, there's no new investment, there are no new ideas. We need a game-changing set of interventions. And I was really disappointed that the Chancellor today wrote a blog that said that he doesn't want to get into a race on subsidies with the United States on who can subsidise green technology. This is a race to save our planet, to save our species. We need much better, more significant interventions from government.
OK. The woman there in the orange cardie.
When are the government going to stop their greenwash? At the same time they're saying they're doing such a wonderful job, they're outsourcing most of the carbon emissions to China and so on, because our manufacturing's been destroyed. And they're granting airport expansions, they're granting Cumbrian coal mines, they're granting North Sea oil. They're talking one thing, but actually doing very, very little.
OK. I will come back to that. The one there with the glasses. Yes.
I think it's quite ridiculous that the Minister talking.
Oh, hang on a minute. I've got the microphone in the wrong place. Wait a minute. I'll come to you in a second. I can't try to see. It's a woman back there in the glasses with the purple top. Yes.
Oh, me. I think this question relates to the earlier question about immigration, because the things that we're doing in Britain now are going to have an impact on a lot of countries around the world. We're seeing it already with very low-lying islands, the Maldives, other places where people are having to leave their homes and resettle. So in terms of how the government is addressing all of this, are you going to start looking at how we start dealing with climate refugees?
Okay. I think it was trying to... Was it you? All right, let's hear from you now.
I think it's quite ridiculous that the Minister's talking about his government's record like that, when only this week the government's own Committee on Climate Change said that they're only on track in 5 out of 45 of the objectives to reach net zero by 2050. And that's at a time when, as I said before, they're continuing airport expansion, like here in Bristol, and they're also giving new oil licences to places in the North Sea and pushing that forward. I think that the government to claim that they're on track is completely ridiculous.
OK. Actually, Helen, I'm about to come to you. Before I do, Andrew, do you want to answer some of these points? Because the government has given the green light to the opening of a new Cumbrian coal mine, which has been criticised by the UN. You've got the point here. You've also got the Climate Change Committee saying the government's not on track. You've got the National Audit Office saying the government's not on track. Oil and gas licences off Scotland. What makes you so sure you're going to get to net zero by 2050?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we have to take other countries with us. This is obviously a global phenomenon. A number of the guests this evening have pointed that out. We are responsible for 1% of global emissions. So if we completely close down our economy tomorrow, we would still scratch the surface of this, and it would put my constituents out of a job. There's no doubt about that. Now, I'm a local MP, and I know Bristol Airport reasonably well. I also know we're trying to green the aviation industry. I don't think anybody wants to wipe it out. I don't think anybody wants to...
Hang on a minute. Why do you think people are laughing at that?
Well, I think it's because aircraft and green don't necessarily automatically go into the same basket.
On Saturday, the government's halving air passenger duty on domestic flights. Does that feel particularly green?
If we are to maintain people's desire to do air travel, go on holiday reasonably cheaply, then we do have to green, as far as we possibly can, the aviation industry. And that's absolutely an imperative. Well, I'm not going to turn round to my constituents who work really hard day in, day out, and who look forward to their 2 weeks in the sun. I'm not going to turn around to them and say, I'm sorry, but you can't do that. But if you lived in France or Germany or Italy, then you can. I think that would not be a popular thing to do. What I would say is, just to reiterate the point, we are streets ahead of our peer group. I'm really proud of the fact that we are decarbonising at the fastest rate in the G7. I think that is a real achievement. We should be proud of that. But I agree entirely, there is so much more to be done. I agree 2050 is a challenge target. It's going to be really difficult. It's going to alter profoundly the way we live our lives. But we have to do it.
Helen. OK, all right, you're saying 2050 is too late. I mean, Helen, it comes down to very difficult choices, doesn't it? I mean, you're getting a barracking here from some people in the audience about flights, for example, but people do want to get on flights, and they do want to go on holiday and not be told that they can't do it, for example. I mean, there's lots of things like that.
Well, that's true, but I think the government has made some really, appalling progress, really, since 2015. I think we did make good progress, actually, when we had a Lib Dem Climate Secretary, Energy Secretary, and we quadrupled the energy output from renewables, but it's been pretty sluggish since, and people in the audience, I think the lady over there already mentioned the Cambrian coal mine. There's no commitment to building.
So you think that should, just to be clear, you think that shouldn't be opened?
It shouldn't be opened, and it was the local people in Cumbria didn't want it open either, and there's no sense to this decision.
So what are the difficult choices that the Lib Dems would make, for example, in order to get us to net zero by 2050, or as the UN wants, by 2040?
Well, there are some easy things you can do, like insulate houses, for example, which wasn't mentioned in today's.
And how easy is that, actually? We've got 20 million homes. Many of them, I mean, insulating new builds is perhaps easier. But when it comes to, Britain's old housing stock, how easy is that, actually?
Well, you've just got to invest, haven't you? We've got to have the right people with the right skills to do those jobs, and we've got to have the right incentives in place for people to want to improve their housing. And there's got to
be... And have you any idea how much that would cost?
And if I don't know off the top of my head how much that would cost, but the reality is we have to make these choices now. And there are ways of bringing down that cost. So, for example, if you do a whole street in one go, that's far cheaper than doing little pepper-potted houses here and there. So there are steps that we can take. But today didn't include allowing onshore wind generation. I mean, there are loads of things that could have been done today that were simple, straightforward steps that were missing from this plan. And I'm afraid the lady up there is right. This was just greenwashing.
Fraser.
We're incredibly down on ourselves in this country about the progress we make. I mean, Andrew Morrison isn't quite right to say we've made the best progress in the G7. We've made the best progress in the G20. There is not an industrialised country in the world that has cut their carbon emissions faster than Britain.
Closed all the coal mines.
Well, yes, we have. We've moved to gas, and it's a lot more efficient, but there is nowhere. And the lady there talks about greenwashing. Now, even if you include the things that we import from China, then we made the second best progress in the whole of the G20. Our carbon emissions are now the lowest since Victorian days, not since 1857 has our carbon output per capita been so low. This is, in my lifetime, carbon emissions have halved. Now, this is incredible progress, and the answer is not to tax the poor off the roads and out of the sky, is not to ramp up people's heating bills to even more unaffordable than it is already. This is being done, by and large, by simple scientific progress, by we're using things far more efficiently, the engines of, I hate to say the word, but capitalism. Capitalism and technology, consumer choices, we are becoming cleaner and greener. We are learning to tread more lightly on the planet.
But when you hear, Fraser, the UN saying we're just not getting there fast enough, we're not going to make it, we're not going to stick to this 1.5 degrees above the industrial level above the 19th century. We're just not going to get
Yeah,
there.
by the we, they don't mean Britain as 1%.
No, sure, they mean the world.
But China.
Fairness, of course.
And by the way, this is where I find Oxfam's position a bit strange, because I would have thought, take China, right? In the last 40 years, China's carbon emissions have quadrupled. A big problem, right? But why they quadrupled? Because China has taken 800 million people out of poverty. When countries rise from their agrarian knees, when they stop being quite so poor, they start to consume a little bit. Now, is China's carbon footprint a price worth paying for taking all those million people out of poverty? I would say absolutely. We need to remember this. When we talk about we, sure, China, the rest of the world, I mean, the rich world's carbon emissions have been going down pretty much for the last couple of decades. It's the rest of the world where they're going up. And that's because people aren't dying quite so young. We're living better, fuller lives, and thank God for that. And carbon, if carbon is the price we pay for that, that is a price worth paying because there are other things we can do. We can do carbon capture. There are plans about that today. We can do all kinds of things. We do not have to make the poor and those who can barely afford to take a flight or drive in their car, they do not have to bear the price for this. Technology can do it, and we know that because look at the last 40 years. The progress we're making in Britain is unbelievably good, and we should congratulate ourselves, I think, a little bit more for that.
Emily.
I think that some country is going to win this global race for becoming a green economy. And I can't see any reason why it shouldn't be us. You know, we were the country that first industrialised. We're the country that should be able to show the way when it comes to an alternative way of living. And that would give us security. We wouldn't need to worry about Putin anymore. We would be making our own energy. We would be insulating our homes so that people's bills went down forever, would not go up again. We would have electric cars, but that does mean that we need to invest in plants that will be making the batteries. You know, we need to have a bit of vision and, quite frankly, a bit of leadership. And what we saw today was yet another bit of greenwash, as people have said, repackaged and a now kind of shinier green bit of paper. But it's Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over again, and it simply isn't radical enough. And I think people want this government to go further and faster because we all know we have an obligation to look after the world and we can lead the way.
But Emily, what country is doing it better than us?
That's not the point.
No, it is.
That's not. Actually, do you know what? Do you know what? It's not the point. It's not the point. It's not the point. First of all, I think it's arguable as to whether other countries are doing worse. I mean, you know, you go to somewhere like Denmark or Sweden, and you see the way in which they insulate their homes and where they get their energy from. But the point is this, right, is that with a bit, I mean, given that we have the wind power that we have around our country, you know, given the potential that we have for renewables, we are not going fast enough. Why don't we have onshore wind? Why do we have these drafty homes? Why aren't we insulating them?
Yeah.
No, we are not.
It's happening all the time. It's happening at breakneck speed.
I'm getting this in... Look, what we need to do is we need to be able to borrow, to invest in our future in order to be able to kickstart our economy again, because our economy has been on a downward slide over the last few years. So not only can we bring people with us in terms of telling them about energy security and insulating their homes, but we can also say to people, there's good jobs out there. There's good jobs out there and there's a good future for our country. But we do need to invest to do that. And that is what we are saying. And that's why we say that we will borrow £28 billion a year and invest it in our future and get our economy going again and get a bit of growth in our economy and be growing in the right way.
Okay. Well, we've been talking about insulating homes. Let's, sort of in that area, let's hear from Melissa Ward. Melissa, where are you?
Should I accept the fact that I may never to be able to afford to buy my own home?
So should you have to accept that you may never be able to afford your own home? And you're... tell us a bit about yourself, Melissa. You're how old?
I'm 25.
Right. And what do you do?
I'm a trainee clinical scientist.
Right. So that's a proper job right there. And you... And so do you think you'll ever be able to afford it? Do you think it's just completely off the cards? You're renting, presumably, at the moment?
I rent at the moment, yes. It just seems quite far out of reach, given rent prices and how difficult it is to save up for a deposit.
Yeah. OK. I'm sure you won't be alone in that. Helen?
Well, I think the crisis in the private rented market is well documented, and I think we're all aware that there's huge pressure on it. And just in terms of I've just set up my office in North Shropshire. A couple of people moved to North Shropshire to come and work for me, found themselves in exactly your position, except they couldn't even find somewhere to rent. And somewhere like North Shropshire, where you would expect the pressures to be low, they're extremely high. People are struggling to find homes.
I mean, well, the number of available homes to rent in the UK has decreased by a third since in the last 18 months. Well, look, housing is your brief. What can be done about it?
Well, I think there are two things. I think first of all, the top-down housing targets that all parties have had on their commitment sheet, if you like, for a long period of time, haven't delivered. We haven't delivered 300,000 new homes since the 60s, and it's not working. So we need to have a fresh approach to how we look at new housing. But for me, most importantly, we need to have a fresh approach to social housing, because we know there are 1.5 million people on social housing waiting lists, and that's adding pressure into the private rented market, pushing rents up for people like yourself who can't save for a deposit because of it. But it's also meaning that we've got families living in inappropriate accommodation, bed and breakfast, people being moved around, you know, kids getting settled in a rented house and then being uprooted because their landlords evicted them and sent somewhere else. It's an appalling situation. The government have promised renters reform. They haven't delivered it. We need to see that. We need to see it now. But I think most importantly, we need to see a proper investment in social housing.
OK. Let's hear from someone with the woman in the further back, the woman in the pink sweater.
Yeah, just to say, as a parent of 2 young children, my husband and I bought our first house together at the age of 26. I can envisage now that my children will not be able to buy a house at that age, or maybe even 36. And the only way that they potentially will be able to have a house is if my husband and I leave them the house that we will eventually finish paying our mortgage when we're into our 60s. But then, if we leave them our house, our children would be subject to paying a 40% inheritance tax on that property. So I can just see the difficulties. This is not only in private rented accommodation, but people getting onto the property ladder. I just can't see it happening for people in their 30s at the moment.
OK. Man here in the dark blue top. Yes, there with the short sleeves, yes, you.
Oh. I think on top of trying to find a new house to buy, I think we need regulation on the houses that are being built. There's a lot of houses like Redcratch Quarter, which is literally right by where I live. They're looking to build 850 new homes, and 100 of them are single-bed, one-bed flats. And I don't know who is someone looking to buy a house who wants to buy a single-bed, one-bed flat, and that could still be going forward. So they're hitting their affordable housing targets, but I don't know who.
Well, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, would that be interesting to you, Melissa? At least you'd own it instead of renting it. Would you consider buying something like that?
I'm not sure it would be what I was hoping to buy.
Right, there you go. So, no, it wouldn't appeal to someone like you. OK, well, Emily?
I mean, I think also we have a background of the highest inflation rate that we've had for 40 years, and that's another problem. And with household incomes, crashing as well, it makes it increasingly difficult. But, in the end, in my view, the only way that we're going to be able to get the younger generation onto the housing market is to build more houses. That's what we need to do. And it's difficult, because I tell you what, whenever there's a planning application for more houses, there's lots of people in the area turn up to the planning meeting in order to say they don't want to have the houses. But the 25-year-olds who might have a chance of buying those houses, unfortunately, aren't there, saying to the councillors, actually, we need to have these homes because we, the younger generation, are being left behind.
How do you get around that? Because the government tried to introduce a policy where it would be easier to build houses, despite people's objections, and so many Conservatives objected, they dropped it pretty damn pronto.
Well,
so what would Labour do about that?
I'm not answerable to the...
No, I'm not, but I'm just saying...
Just because Tories are not,
Yeah, but the point is, it can be hard when you've got lots of people objecting. How do you get around that? What's your plan for that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be strong about this, and you have to be clear that actually there is
make it harder for people to object.
There is intergenerational injustice going on, right? There's the older generation, like myself, those of us who essentially hold on to the levers of power, and we're the ones who are looking after ourselves, and a younger generation who are being overlooked. That's the point. And we need to kind of have and anyone who's under 25 who thinks it's a good idea not to vote, really, they should be much angrier than they are.
But how do you make it easier, Emily, to build more houses, which clearly is a Labour policy, when, as you say, when new housing proposals are put in, lots of people object to them? How does Labour get around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look again at the planning regulations. Of course we do, and we have to look, as I say, look to the future, and not just sort of short-termism and kind of, you know, as the Conservatives are doing. The Conservatives might have an idea, and then you get, you know, 20 of them saying boo, and the Prime Minister runs away. I mean, that's what's going on, you know. So we need to have, you know, a bit of vision and a bit of kind of idea that we do need to look after the younger generation. We need to build more houses, and frankly, the older generation need to get their heads around that quick.
You need to persuade Labour councils to do that as well. I mean, the thing is, I think this is something which happens, sure, but national governments can say we want lots of houses. Every national government pretty much does. It's for local government they tend to put a spanner in the works. Here in Bristol Council, for example, only a few months ago they voted not to reject the government's more ambitious house building agenda. They said, no, we don't want this. We want, I can't think they mentioned environmentalism or something. And I think Bristol, this is particularly acute around here. House prices here are very expensive. I've got family here. I've got a 18-year-old niece who's here tonight. And what are her chances of, like Hannah, being able to buy a house? Especially when you pick up the local press here, every time somebody wants to do a housing development, there are protests galore. Absolutely, every time and time and time again. And it seems to be there's an imbalance here. In general elections, people say, yes, we want more houses. But when it comes to, on a local basis, the NIMBYs seem to speak more loudly than young people. And I mean, Emily's absolutely right in what she says about we need to build more houses. But we need Labour councils to be saying, yes, we need to build more houses, to do everything they can to help the provision of that. We need Tory councils. We need
do.
Well, no, the thing is, this isn't a party political issue, but the councils in general are way more swayed by NIMBY voices than they are by people like Hannah.
My Labour council tries to build houses wherever they can. The joke in my constituency is if you move your car in the morning, you come back, there's a flat there. I mean, we really are trying to build as much as we can.
Well, I don't think anybody can
land.
accuse Bristol Council of taking that view.
The man there in the green top with the glasses.
I think it's not just the importance of house prices, but also like rent as well. When I first moved to Bristol 2 years ago, I paid £500 a month rent. I now nearly pay £700 a month rent for the same room. And I think there needs to be some type of regulation.
And there's talk
there.
of rent controls, aren't there, here as well? The council's thinking of that. And that would make the problem a lot worse. Everywhere it's been tried, rent controls makes it worse.
But that's why the Renters Reform Bill is so important, because at the moment, Section 21 evictions mean that landlords can kick you out just so that they can put the rent up by an enormous amount, and there's no long-term secure tenancy. So this Renters Reform Bill is really important so that we can ban those evictions, those no-fault evictions, and bring in longer-term, sort of 3-year tenancies so that that doesn't happen. And the government have said they'll do it, and frankly, I don't know what they're waiting for.
OK. Well, Melissa wants to buy her own home, though. That's what she wants. Danny?
Well, I think there's something that links all three of the questions we've been talking about today, about whether it's migration, climate change or housing. And we've got a political system in which short-termism trumps long-termism, in which self-interest... The lady up there was talking about symptoms and causes of migration. You know, tonight, 800 million people will go to bed hungry around the world, and yet our government is cutting the aid budget. Mobility and the factors that drive it are long-term and are going to get worse. We need long-term solutions. Climate change, the young man here who was calling for more ambitious targets by 2030, while politicians are arguing about who are we going faster than with. Are we doing as much as we can to deliver intergenerational justice? And the same goes for housing. We're scared to tackle inequality. Those who happen to have wealth are seeing their wealth accumulate at greater rates than we've seen in history, but young people can't get on the property ladder. We need a political system...
Andrew, how are you going to help Melissa get on the property ladder?
Melissa, I want you to have your own home. I think it's an aspiration.
Well, not half as much as she does. How are you going to help?
I've got 5 children about your age, and I live this experience, and I'm with you. I'm from the party that introduced right to buy, and the reason for that, the reason that was a good thing is it gave people, for the first time in generations, the kind of thing that a lot of us in this room will have just taken for granted. So the aspiration is the correct one. We built 2.2 million houses since 2010. I have lived the experience.
Yeah, but you know, you're way off target in terms of meeting your target of 300,000.
So I deal with all this, and Emily is quite...
OK, but so how do you help her? I was quite some time ago. How are you going to help her now?
I need to make this point because it's the lived experience of all constituency MPs. The reason we got the 2.2 million is because we have lived in a target-driven environment. That's what's driven these. But locally, it means that we have to face down sometimes vociferous opposition from people who don't want these houses on their doorstep. But you go round my constituency and 650 up and down this country, you'll see building going on right now. But it's not fast enough.
And the government's dropped the compulsory targets now.
Part of it is the way that landowners and developers are gaming the system. And I think that's a great unspoken problem in this. We need to deal with that. I accept it. It's a fair challenge. And I suspect each one of us politicians, each one of our parties running up to the next general election are going to have something that's going to convince you to vote for us. And we're not there yet. But your aspirations are right, one. I want you to own your home. I'm confident you will. We've all got a job to do, because I don't suppose any of us have given you a convincing answer tonight to design something that's going to work for you.
So from what you've heard, are you confident that you will?
Not entirely.
Right, OK. We hear you. Let's take another question from Anne McConville.
What action would you take to stop juvenile knife crime, vandalism and substance abuse?
So, only this week, the Prime Minister has announced his anti-social behaviour action plan, which aims to tackle all of those, plus a few other things as well. Fraser, what action would you take?
Every 5 years or so, each government goes through the same kind of convulsion to crack down on antisocial behaviour. And it's these, the various things. They're going to ban laughing gas. I think that was the latest thing. I mean, and it's they never seem to be very persuasive. But when it comes to things like substance abuse, I don't quite regard that as antisocial behaviour. I see that more as social breakdown. That's more of you talking about what can you do to we're talking there about people who live in the margins of society. What can you do to support families, broken families? What can you do to help people who aren't employed get into society? That's
it's not just people like that who are kids of people like that taking laughing gas.
But if you look at overwhelmingly, if you look at substance abuse, for example, this is problems of. It's not. There's a very big difference between that and between, I don't know, I mean, disorder on the corner of the streets. So I think I wouldn't categorise that as antisocial behaviour necessarily. I would say that's a problem of a broken society, and we've slipped into that again. So there's a lot more that the government can do, I think, to support people in the margins and to think about it systemically. I think that a lot of local authorities have cut back the counselling and the social services they've done over the last 10 years. I think that was a mistake. And I think quite a lot of the time there's nobody you can go to for help now, far less than you were able to 10, 15 years ago. So there you can see the edges of our society starting to fray in a very alarming way. And I don't see it as a law and order crackdown. I don't think any kind of law and order crackdown are going to help the sort of problems that you talk about.
Danny.
I agree with Fraser. We need to invest in our public services. Everywhere that Oxfam works around the world, we find the best way to reduce poverty is to provide people with a safety net. Invest in education, invest in health, allow those people who are living on the margins of your society a route to a better life. And yet in this country, it's a tragedy that the sorts of issues we deal with in other parts of the world, we're having to talk about here because we've been underinvesting in the safety net, in social protection. And we talk about a cost of living crisis here, which sounds as if there's some sort of inevitable mechanism, an invisible hand that's, driving inflation. That's not what's happening. We have an inequality crisis. We are...
So Danny, where do you think the money should come from for investing more in these services?
Well, we need to...
Is it higher taxes? What were you saying?
Yes, we've had very historically low levels of taxes on, say, wealth.
And we're paying the highest level of tax we've paid since the Second World War, I think, at the moment. But
right. We've had cuts...
Not the rich, you're saying.
And on wealth taxes, the returns to wealth in the last few years, in the last few decades across the world, have far outstripped the returns to labour. Last year, 1.7 billion workers in the world had their wages grow slower than prices, which meant that they're worse off as a result of what's happening. That's happening not because of some sort of global phenomenon. It's happening because of deliberate policy choices not to protect those who are vulnerable, not to raise the minimum wage, not to tax the wealthy.
OK. Let's have our... The man in the corner there, yes, in the black top, black jacket.
Good evening. Surely the situation starts with community policing, Fiona. You had a police officer, I think, on your last show, was almost in tears, telling us there's no community policing at all these days. They're all being diverted into other crimes. And I just think if we've got more community police, we can start dealing with these issues.
OK. And the woman there in the green top and the glasses.
Yeah, I'm staggered, to be honest, at the gap between the audience and the panel, and the notion that you think that you're succeeding on green energy, or that people support human beings washing up on our shores or being deported to Rwanda. I'm absolutely staggered. The way that we talk about serious youth violence is not to talk about crime, it's to talk about the trauma that they've actually experienced in the last 2 years. You have cut funding, you've cut budgets in school. We can't recruit teachers. We can't recruit teaching assistants. You've cut social workers. You have cut local services to the bone. And then you're worried about antisocial behaviour. There are no youth services. There are no youth services. And absolutely, there is so clearly a gap. There is such a massive gap between what you're saying and people's experience. Why can't people buy a house? Look at their wages. They're a teacher, they have been through university, paid over 30 grand, if not more, to go to university. This ideological, want to control rent, use rent control, want to have houses, build more houses, because you can find the money to build HS2 and drill through forests. You can this is what we're talking about. These are ideological choices. You've done nothing for green energy in 13 years. Nothing.
Okay. Let's put some of these points to the minister.
So I think when we're talking about young people and supporting them, what has been put in place for young people? A tutoring programme.
OK, let's put some of these points to the minister.
It's woeful. It is woeful.
You heard the lady.
The original question was about knife crime.
Well, and vandalism and substance abuse, but you've heard two people here and from the audience also talking about, well...
In the time you give me, Fiona,
in terms of what action will you
I'll try
take, and they're suggesting not cutting services might be part of the action you could take.
OK, in terms of knife crime and antisocial behaviour, because they're part of the same spectrum, it's all crime, but serious crime has come down quite a lot. 50% since 2010, except for fraud. And the gentleman is absolutely right.
Why would you leave out fraud? I don't understand that.
Because
if you put fraud in, it's crime.
What happens is the criminals have become invisible, and it touches.
But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be part of the statistics.
No, but it touches on the point about community policing, because although we've recruited 16,000 policemen. What people say to me is they want visible policing, but those policemen are tackling online fraud. That's where the criminals
No, they're not.
Yes,
no, they're not. They're
yes,
absolutely
they are.
not.
Online fraud is a calumny because it
not.
affects the most vulnerable. It affects the elderly and
you
those
have 1,000 police officers dealing with fraud.
Less robust.
You have 8,000.
Hang on, let Moss, then I'll let you.
So it's vital that we do deal with fraud, and I'm very grateful to the gentleman for mentioning it. But a 50% cut since 2010 is a real achievement.
Hang on, but I'm really confused. If fraud is such a calumny, why are you not including it in the figures?
Those are the published figures. So those figures have excluded.
So if you include fraud, crime has gone up.
No, it won't have gone up.
Well, hang on.
It will have. It's gone down. That's
when the Conservative, I thought you might mention this. When the
50%.
Conservative government came into power, there were just over 4 million recorded crimes. It is now 6.3 million. So, and there are different ways of recording crime. In fairness,
really
I get that, but that's according to the Office for National Statistics. So I just thought I'd put that in there. What action would you take to stop juvenile knife crime, vandalism, and substance abuse, Emily?
Can I talk about fraud for a moment? Just
very briefly. I've only got 4 minutes left, and I've got to get Helen in as well.
40% of crime is fraud. 1,000 police officers are dealing with fraud. You have 8,000 people in the Department of Work and Pensions dealing with fraud. I mean, that is the priorities. You know, we are not dealing with fraud properly, and we don't even record attempted fraud. So if someone tries to have a go at you and you ring up action fraud, they won't even record it because it's an attempted fraud and therefore not a fraud, and therefore they don't bother to record it. So, you know, the amount of crime that's actually going on. And the last lot of statistics that were published, well, I think were published 6 years ago, on the amount of money that we think that we lost in this country as a result of fraud, and it was £198 billion. And that is the amount of money we spent on the National Health Service in the first year of the pandemic. So, you know, the idea that the Tories can talk about, you know, crime going down when they're overlooking £198 billion worth of crime is quite extraordinary, in my view.
And just listen briefly, because I must bring Helen in. What action would you take to stop... Let's deal with Anne's question. She's asked it. What action would you take to stop juvenile knife crime, vandalism and stuff?
So very quickly, so we would reintroduce the PCSOs, the community police officers that we've been talking about, because no community can have policing done to it. You have to work with police officers, and that's the way in which you make a community safe. And the community's priorities then become the police officers' priorities because they work closely with that community. We have to spend, and we, Labour, would spend £1 billion on mental health, and we would be putting mental health workers in the schools. Every secondary school would have a mental health worker, and all primary schools would have one that they would be sharing, you know, so that we can deal with those issues as well. Right. We would stop the way in which you can buy knives so easily online. I've got a list.
I know. Otherwise, Helen is not going to get a word in. Just forgive me, and I must let Helen have a chance as well.
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think we need to split out low-level antisocial behaviour, knife crime and substance abuse, because I think they're all quite different things. I'm not going to repeat what Danny and Fraser said about substance abuse because I broadly agree with them. On low-level antisocial behaviour, it does ruin people's lives when they feel unsafe to go out. I think the lack of community support officers is a real problem. The number of visible police officers on the street has fallen, and locally people will tell you they haven't seen an officer, they can't be bothered to report a crime because no one turns up. And ultimately, you're not being tough on crime if nobody even bothers to report one in the first place. Knife crime, I think, is much more problematic. I think youth services are critical to that. And I think the hollowing out of local council budgets that we've seen since 2015, £2 billion cut from local council budgets, 35% reduction in some cases, is what's at the bottom of that problem with youth and some of the types of crime that they turn to.
OK. I've got about a minute left. Let's hear from the woman there. Yes, you.
Crime and poverty are interlinked, and we're, you know, the poorest in our society have been getting poorer and poorer. And one of the things that I notice is when parents are stressed, that sort of impacts on the children. And that's where we have to tackle things. It's within the families, because children aren't born criminals. But when their parents are sort of struggling with just basic, you know, trying to survive, and they don't have the time to look after the children, you know, then we're creating more and more problems. And that's really...
Bring back the sure starts.
Yeah, exactly. Pay people better and respect them, and I wish this government would stop vilifying the most vulnerable in society. It's all it's doing is putting division and hate, and it doesn't help anything. What we need is solutions. We need a lot more love in our society, a lot more care.
A lot more love. A lot more love on the panel, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, thank you for your point. That is it for this week. Our time is up. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to our audience for coming along here tonight. Thank you for watching. Remember, we're on iPlayer at 8 o'clock every week, if after 10 o'clock news is too late for you. But from Question Time in Bristol. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Big shout out to Bristol. That was one of the best question sounds I've heard in a while. The audience actually had a clue instead of like gormless fucking cunts. Fucking Bristol. Bet they vote Labour. I hope they vote Labour. Anyway. Points that were made. Yeah. Eating meat. That's actually an issue as well for global warming. A lot of people don't know that, but it actually is. Even if you don't agree with like being a vegan or whatever, that does contribute a lot to our CO2. As someone said about global warming, interesting topic. Global warming, IPCC report on global warming. Very interesting report. They leave out one major problem in that report, which I found totally amazing as someone who likes science. The fucking sun. So they don't include the sun, which you would think they would, considering it's the fucking sun. They left it out of why the world's getting hotter. Now, if you know anything about anything, you would know that you could actually ice skate on the River Thames once upon a time, when literally the sun went to sleep and the earth literally nearly froze to death on its own. Just saying. And if you look up the history of the planet, it's been mostly cold, not hot. The reason why global warming happens is because the fucking stupid earth gets in not equilibrium, shall we say, and then goes into a deep freeze. There's reasons for that. There's currents in the oceans, which are hot. If you know anything about oceans or whatever. And also what happens in the air, which is the North Stream, whatever the fuck it's called, which is the same thing, which is how you get a nice hot summertime in the Northern Hemisphere. When they break, we're fucked at that point because there's no circulation of heat. It's like basically having a nice house and just having one radiator on or some shit. It doesn't work. You need to put all your radiators on, all of them, right, etc. That's what happens with global warming. Other parts of the show that I kind of want to talk about, again, fucking my pet bugbear, housing. Stop. Just build the fucking houses. Stop trying to sell everybody a house. It's fucking pointless. The vast majority of Germans live in council houses or social housing. It's the government job to build houses, not sell you them. You pay tax for a reason. To fucking have a house, not own one. Think about that like later on down the fucking line. Your job is to have a fucking house. If you're broke, you need a house. Build houses. That's why we pay tax. Anything else? Migrants, just invade France. I've been saying that for ages. The best way to stop migrants coming to Britain, invade France. Problem solved.